Today, millions of people share their lives with dogs. They guard our homes, walk beside us, comfort us when we're stressed, and somehow understand us in ways few animals can. But this closeness didn't appear suddenly. It wasn't planned and it wasn't simple. So how did a powerful wild predator become our closest companion? To answer that, we need to go far back, tens of thousands of years, to a time when early humans and ancient wolves lived in the same harsh world, competing for food, shelter, and survival. Tonight, we'll follow their slow, unlikely journey toward each other. A journey shaped by hunger, caution, curiosity, and eventually, trust. A journey that gave rise to the very first dogs. So get comfortable, let the day fade away, and join me as we explore how two very different species became partners and friends. Around 40,000 years ago, the world was entering one of its final glacial periods. Much of the northern hemisphere was colder and quieter than it is today. Vast plains stretched across Eurasia, dotted with patches of forest and thick layers of snow. Early humans, small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers, moved constantly in search of food, shelter, and safer ground. These people lived with uncertainty. Winters could last longer than expected. Herds sometimes changed direction without warning, and predators roamed the same lands they depended on. Every day required awareness, cooperation, and adaptation. Not far from these human groups lived ancient wolves. They were not exactly the wolves we know today. Their bodies were slightly heavier, their jaws stronger, and their behavior shaped by a harsher ecosystem. They worked together to hunt large prey, tracked scents across frozen ground, and protected their packs with remarkable loyalty. At this time, humans and wolves shared the same world, but not the same life. They watched each other from a distance, mostly out of caution. Humans understood wolves as potential threats, fast, coordinated hunters that could attack if desperate. Wolves, on the other hand, saw humans as unusual creatures who carried fire, made sharp tools, and walked long distances without tiring. Though both species were intelligent and social, their interactions were minimal and mostly based on avoidance. Still, something important was happening without anyone noticing. They were becoming familiar with each other's presence. Humans often left behind animal remains after processing a hunt. Fat, bones, hides, and scraps they didn't need. These leftovers created opportunities. Some wolves, especially the less aggressive ones, dared to approach abandoned sites after the humans had moved on. These individuals fed on the remains, gaining valuable calories without expending the energy required for a full hunt. For wolves living on the edge of survival, this new resource mattered. For humans, the distant shapes lurking near camps were just another part of the environment. But these small, indirect exchanges were the quiet beginning of a long evolutionary shift. At this stage, there was no partnership, no mutual trust, only two species facing the same challenges in the same harsh environment. Yet nature often works slowly, through repeated patterns rather than sudden events. Humans moved, wolves followed from a distance. Camps were set up, scraps were left behind, and cautious wolves learned when it was safe to approach. Across thousands of nights under the same cold sky, humans and ancient wolves continued this unspoken dance, and without realizing it, they were taking the first steps toward a bow-aze the years passed. A pattern began to repeat itself across many human camps. After a successful hunt, people would bring back meat, skin, and bones. They used what they needed, cooked what they could, and left behind a trail of scraps. Shattered bones, pieces of fat, bits of organs that no one wanted to eat. Long after the people had finished their meal, movement could be seen at the edge of the darkness. Shapes slipped in and out of the shadows, ancient wolves, drawn by the smell of food. Most wolves stayed far away. They watched, waited, and only approached when the fires burned low and the camp had grown quiet. But some individuals took a slightly different approach. They were still careful, still alert, yet a little braver when it came to scavenging near human scent. They learned that humans were dangerous at close range, but that humans also meant leftovers. Over many generations, this behavior had consequences. Wolves that were able to tolerate human presence even from a distance had access to easier food. They didn't have to risk injury by hunting large prey as often. They didn't need to chase herds for hours across open ground. A smaller risk for a decent reward. Evolution favors such strategies. From the human side, these visits were first seen as a nuisance or a potential threat. A wolf too close to the camp could be frightening. People might shout, throw stones, or wave burning sticks to push them away. But not every wolf reacted the same way. The most aggressive animals fled and stayed away. The calmer ones retreated, circled, and tried again later. Over time, humans began to recognize that some of these wolves were less dangerous than others. This slow, mutual filtering process, humans discouraging the boldest threats, the environment rewarding the most flexible and cautious wolves, started to shape a new type of animal. Still wild, still far from pets, but already walking a slightly different evolutionary path. At this stage, there were no collars, no names, and no petting. Just a repeated scene. Fire in the middle, humans around it, and beyond the circle of light, a few quiet shadows, waiting for the right moment to move in and eat. Those shadows were the ancestors of dogs. The evenings in late Pleistocene camps often followed a familiar pattern. After a long day of tracking game, humans gathered around the fire, sharing whatever they had managed to hunt. The firelight pushed back the darkness only a few meters, leaving the rest of the world in deep shadow. Beyond that shadow, unseen but often sensed, shapes moved silently. One of these shapes belonged to a young, cautious wolf-like animal. It was thin from the long winter and carried the restless energy of hunger. But hunger alone wasn't enough to guide its decisions. It also needed to survive, and humans were unpredictable. They could ignore, feed, or attack, depending on mood, season, or circumstance. Approaching them required constant calculation. This animal had learned from experience, and from its mother, how close one could safely come. It had observed which humans tended to shout or throw stones, and which simply watched without reacting. It had learned the rhythm of the camp, when people were alert, when they relaxed, and when they drifted into the softer focus of evening tiredness. Over time, these patterns created something like familiarity. Not trust, not yet, but familiarity. One night, the animal noticed something different. A human dropped a piece of bone slightly farther from the main pile. The gesture was small, almost careless, yet it mattered. The animal stepped forward, hesitated, retreated, then approached again, drawing on every lesson encoded in its instincts and shaped by its short life. Finally, it took the bone and moved away. Nothing dramatic happened. The humans didn't chase it. The fire kept burning. The cold wind kept blowing. But in evolutionary history, these uneventful moments sometimes matter more than dramatic ones. Nothing changed, and yet everything had begun to change. Over many nights, these interactions repeated themselves. The animal approached a little sooner. It stayed a little longer. It flinched less at human voices. The humans, meanwhile, grew used to seeing it and perhaps even began to distinguish it from other animals by its size, its movements, or the pattern of its fur. In groups of early humans, children played a subtle but important role. Children were curious, more willing to observe than to react aggressively. They spoke in softer tones and made smaller movements, which frightened wild animals less. A child dropping a scrap of food or simply watching quietly could influence an animal's behavior in ways adults never considered. These tiny social moments, unnoticed by the group, were part of the foundation of early domestication. The animal also learned something else. Proximity to humans was not only a food source, but also a kind of protection. Other predators, larger wolves, cave lions, hyenas, avoided human camps because they feared fire and human weapons. For a smaller, more cautious wolf, staying near humans might be safer than staying with its own pack, especially if competition for food was fierce. As this pattern continued across generations, certain behavioral traits became increasingly common among the animals that lingered around camps. Less aggression, more curiosity, a higher tolerance for human sounds and movements. These traits gave them survival advantages in this unique niche, a niche created entirely by human presence. From the human perspective, these animals still weren't companions. They were background elements of life, visible in the corner of the eye, occasionally useful as early warning alarms, but not yet integrated into daily activity. Still, something subtle was shifting in human perception. They began to see that these animals did not always behave like threats. Some seemed almost predictable, even cooperative in their own wild way. The gap between human and wolf was still wide, but the edges were softening. Each quiet night, each cautious approach, each bone tossed into darkness, drew the two species one step closer. Over hundreds of generations, these small steps were enough to steer an entire lineage away from the wild and toward a future intertwined with humanity in ways no one could have imagined. As these early wolf-like animals spent more time near human camps, their role in the environment began to shift in ways neither species intended. At first, they were simply scavengers, silent figures moving through the dark once humans had settled down for the night. But the longer they stayed near people, the more both sides began to notice subtle benefits. The animals' senses were far sharper than those of any human. Their ears detected distant footsteps, cracking branches, and faint rustling long before humans were aware of anything unusual. Their sense of smell could identify predators, wounded animals, strangers, and even changes in the weather. These abilities had always been essential for survival in the wild, but now, unintentionally, they were becoming part of the human camp's safety net. When something approached the camp at night, a large predator, a wandering scavenger, or even an unfamiliar human, the animals often sensed it first. Sometimes they growled softly. Other times they barked or moved in a way that caused nearby humans to glance up, alerted by the sudden shift in behavior. Even without understanding the animals fully, humans recognized the pattern. When these creatures were uneasy, danger might be near. This early warning effect gradually became familiar. People didn't train the animals. It simply happened because the animals' instincts made them react to threats. And humans, being observant by nature, learned to read these reactions. Over time, this became an unspoken exchange, an accidental partnership that emerged from coexistence rather than intention. For the animals, staying near camps also provided advantages. Other predators avoided human fire and weapons, making the area around camp safer than many parts of the wilderness. The animals still fled if someone came too close, but they began to understand the boundary. Stay near enough to gain safety and food, but far enough to avoid sudden conflict. As generations passed, natural selection continued its quiet but steady influence. Animals that were more aggressive or prone to attack humans were pushed away or killed, reducing their chances of reproducing. Calmer individuals, those that tolerated human presence and reacted predictably, survived longer and raised more offspring. Without meaning to, humans were shaping the behavior and temperament of an entire population. Physical changes began to appear subtly as well. Animals adapted to life near humans tended to be slightly smaller and more agile, with differences in their facial expressions or tail carriage that made them easier for humans to interpret. These weren't yet the floppy-eared, varied coat dogs we know today, but they were clearly diverging from their fully wild relatives. Human groups, meanwhile, developed a kind of mental map that included these animals. They were no longer seen only as threats. They had become part of the nightly landscape, a familiar presence that brought a measure of safety. People began to speak about them more casually. The animals were restless last night, or I heard them growling toward the north. Their behavior became information, useful, even necessary. Still, the relationship remained fragile. The animals were not owned, controlled, or commanded. They were independent creatures that chose to orbit human life for their own reasons. And yet, within this delicate balance, the foundation of a deeper partnership was being built. No one at the time realized how significant these changes were. The humans around the fire simply felt a bit safer. The animals in the shadows simply found it easier to survive. But evolution rarely needs more than this. Small advantages repeated across many generations. What had begun as scavenging was slowly becoming cooperation. What had been accidental was becoming meaningful, and the distance between the two species continued to shrink, one quiet night at a time. As the presence of these early proto-dogs around human groups became more consistent, the rhythm of daily life began to evolve. Hunters started to notice that the animals were no longer just background figures appearing at night. They would follow the group at a distance as they set out across plains and forests, sometimes trailing far behind, sometimes weaving through the landscape in wide arcs, always alert to scents and movements that humans could not detect. During a hunt, humans relied on a mixture of endurance, cooperation, and tool use. They tracked herds across long distances, reading the ground for faint signs. A broken twig, a compressed patch of grass, a trail of footprints fading into harder soil. But the animals following them had an entirely different set of tools. Their noses scanned the air constantly. Their ears tracked faint disturbances. Their bodies reacted instinctively to the presence of prey or predators long before humans sensed anything unusual. Hunters began to observe this. When an animal stiffened, lifted its head, or changed direction suddenly, it was often an indicator of nearby movement. These signals were not deliberate communication, they were natural reactions, yet the effect on the hunt could be profound. Humans who paid attention to these shifts found themselves better guided across the land, more aware of prey fleeing ahead or circling back behind cover. At times, an injured animal escaped after a spear throw, but left a trail of scent too faint for humans alone to follow. The proto-dogs, however, could detect these faint chemical traces on the wind. Their behavior, pausing, then moving with intent, revealed the direction of the wounded prey. Hunters who followed these indications often recovered meat that might otherwise have been lost, making the difference between abundance and scarcity for the group. The relationship deepened in small ways. When humans rested, the animals lingered nearby, waiting quietly. When humans resumed walking, so did they. In colder climates, these animals sometimes slept closer to the edges of camps, drawn by warmth yet still wary. Over time, the cautious distance shrank. Humans, remembering which individuals had behaved predictably on hunts, began to tolerate their presence more. Children, as in many early domestication scenarios, played a unique role. Young members of the group had more patience, more curiosity, and fewer assumptions about danger. They sometimes fed scraps to the proto-dogs. Sometimes they imitated their movements or called to them with gentle sounds. These interactions created a foundation for social bonding far deeper than simple scavenging. A young animal raised near children often became more trusting of humans as it grew, creating a new generation of proto-dogs that were easier to approach and more likely to stay near the group. Some groups even began to bring orphaned pups back to camp. A pup raised among humans adapted quickly to human rhythms, when to wake, when to rest, when to follow, and when to stay near the fire. These pups grew into adults with strong attachments to the group, becoming reliable partners during hunts by instinct rather than training. Their comfort with humans made them bridge figures between the wild and human worlds. As seasons passed, these human-raised animals became essential members of the camp. They learned the smells of human tools, the taste of cooked food, and the meaning of different human tones. In return, humans learned the subtle variations in their barks, whines, and posture. Even without formal commands, the two species began to coordinate actions in ways that surprised both. This gradual development, built on shared hunts, shared spaces, and shared survival, marked the beginning of true companionship. Humans realized they hunted better with these animals beside them. The proto-dogs realized they lived more safely and ate more reliably with humans. What had begun as scavenging evolved into the earliest example of teamwork between humans and another species. The wilderness was still harsh, but now humans did not walk it entirely alone. The first companions were taking shape, step by step, hunt by hunt, night by night. The animals that lived closest to humans began to undergo physical and behavioral transformations that would eventually define the species we now call dogs. Evolution usually works slowly, but when a new ecological niche forms, as it did around human camps, the pace of change can accelerate dramatically. The niche near humans rewarded specific traits: calmness, curiosity, adaptability, and social awareness. Over many generations, these traits became increasingly common. The earliest physical changes were subtle. The proto-dogs that thrived near humans tended to be slightly smaller than their fully wild relatives. This wasn't because humans preferred smaller animals, but because smaller and less aggressive individuals were more successful at living in close quarters with humans. They could approach camps without provoking defensive reactions and slip into newly formed social roles. Behaviorally, the changes were more dramatic. These animals became highly attuned to human actions. They noticed when humans raised their voices, when they shifted their weight, or when they pointed toward something. Even before deliberate training existed, these animals began to interpret human gestures intuitively. This ability to understand pointing is something wolves rarely exhibit, but dogs recognize with ease. The roots of that skill were forming here in these ancient interactions. Cognitive changes followed. Animals that could read human emotions survived better. If a human group accepted them, they received food, warmth, and protection. If they misread a human's tension or aggression, they might be chased or attacked. This selective pressure encouraged the evolution of animals that were sensitive to mood and tone. Their brains adapted to track social cues across species, a rare ability in the animal kingdom. As their behavior aligned more closely with human patterns, their bodies changed too. Variations in fur, body shape, and facial structure became more pronounced. Some proto-dogs developed softer features, a side effect of selection for tameness. Shorter snouts and rounder heads appeared in certain lineages. Ears that once stood erect sometimes became floppy, a change linked to the way domestication affects cartilage and hormone levels. These physical adaptations weren't intentional. They emerged from thousands of cycles of survival and reproduction within the human sphere. Humans didn't start by breeding dogs for appearance or specialized roles. That came much later. Early selection was entirely practical. Animals that behaved well were allowed to stay. Those that didn't were pushed out. Over time, the cumulative effect of this simple dynamic reshaped the species. The proto-dogs also started forming deeper emotional bonds with humans. They began to seek human attention, not only food. They approached slowly, tails relaxed, ears lowered in a gesture of trust. Humans responded in kind, offering scraps or simply allowing them to rest nearby. These moments created something no other species shared with early humans: cross-species social bonding. This bond influenced daily life. The animals learned to rest during the quieter parts of the day and to awaken when humans stirred. They followed not only on hunts, but also during migrations, moving with the rhythm of human footsteps. They integrated into the group's awareness, becoming extensions of human senses and instincts. By this stage, the relationship had crossed an irreversible threshold. These animals were no longer fully wild. They could survive without humans, but they thrived with them. They had become a new type of creature, one with a social world that straddled two species. This was the birth of the dog's mind, flexible, observant, cooperative, and deeply connected to human behavior. Their bodies had begun to change, but their minds changed even more. In the quiet nights near ancient fires, the first true dogs were emerging, not through deliberate design, but through the slow, powerful force of living beside humans. As human groups migrated into new regions, dogs followed them into environments they had never encountered. This shared expansion shaped both species in profound ways. Together they entered cold northern plains, dense forests, rugged mountains, and eventually distant continents where new prey, predators, and climates demanded adaptation. In the far north, dogs became essential for survival. Their thick coats protected them from freezing winds. Their senses detected danger long before humans could see through blowing snow. At night, they curled beside humans, sharing warmth in shelters carved from ice or built from branches and hides. This closeness strengthened the bond, creating routines of mutual reliance that lasted for generations. In dense forests, dogs acted as early warning systems, alerting humans to hidden predators such as large cats or bears. Their ability to hear subtle movements beneath layers of foliage made them invaluable. Hunters who traveled with dogs rarely walked blindly into danger. The dog's alert posture or sudden stillness revealed what humans could not perceive. On open savannas, dogs excelled as trackers. Their noses followed faint scent trails for hours, sometimes leading hunters to wounded animals too distant for humans alone to track. The cooperative hunts that emerged in these regions were more sophisticated than those earlier in history. Humans began to expect dogs to assist, and dogs learned the patterns of human movement. When to run ahead, when to circle, when to wait. In mountainous terrain, dogs helped guide humans along narrow paths and alerted them to rock slides or shifting winds. Their agility made them natural scouts. They could move ahead of the group, then return to signal safe routes. Even without formal training, their instincts aligned with human needs, shaping a partnership that was both practical and intuitive. As societies became more established, dogs took on new roles. They guarded camps from predators and rival human groups. Their presence alone deterred threats. In some cultures, dogs became part of spiritual beliefs. Evidence from ancient burial sites shows dogs interred with people, sometimes with objects suggesting deep emotional value. These burials indicate not only practical dependence, but genuine affection. Dogs diversified as humans spread across the world. In some regions, they grew large and powerful, suited for guarding. In others, they remained small and agile, ideal for navigating dense vegetation or hunting small animals. Coat color shifted in response to climate and environment. Over time, these differences became the earliest forms of dog types, long before modern breeds existed. Human society evolved alongside dogs. Gardening and early agriculture changed settlement patterns, and dogs adapted yet again. They guarded fields from animals, protected stored food, and even helped manage early livestock. With every cultural shift, dogs found new ways to integrate themselves into human life. The emotional bond deepened. Humans began to see dogs not only as useful, but as loyal, attentive beings who shared their journeys. Dogs learned to recognize human facial expressions, understanding joy, fear, and anger in ways no other animal could. This emotional intelligence created a connection as significant as any practical benefit. Together, humans and dogs crossed continents, survived harsh climates, and adapted to new challenges. Their partnership became a defining feature of human expansion. Wherever humans went, dogs went too, guiding, protecting, and traveling at their side. The world that emerged from these migrations was shaped partly by human ingenuity and partly by the presence of dogs, whose abilities expanded what humans alone could achieve. When viewed from the perspective of deep time, the story of how dogs became part of human life is extraordinary. It began with small, cautious steps, an animal approaching a fire, a human choosing not to chase it away, and expanded into a relationship that would shape cultures around the globe. No other species became so intertwined with human history. By the time early agricultural societies emerged, dogs were already long-established partners. They guarded settlements, accompanied hunters, and watched over families during the night. In some communities, dogs became symbols of protection and loyalty. In others, they were seen as guides or spiritual guardians, appearing in myths and burial rites that reveal how deeply they had entered human imagination. The emotional dimension of the bond grew stronger with each generation. Dogs learned to respond to human emotions in a way that no wild animal could. They recognized distress, excitement, and calmness. They adjusted their behavior accordingly, comforting, guarding, or joining in celebration. This sensitivity was not trained. It was inherited from countless ancestors who had survived by understanding humans. Humans, in turn, began to interpret canine emotions, the meaning behind a tail wag, the significance of a lowered head, the difference between a warning bark and a playful one. This mutual comprehension created a unique social connection between species. Humans began to value dogs not only for their skills, but for the companionship they offered. As civilizations advanced, the role of dogs expanded further. They became herders, protectors of livestock, and guardians of property. They assisted fishermen, tracked criminals, and carried messages. In some societies, dogs accompanied warriors into battle, trusting their human companions so deeply that they rushed into danger without hesitation. Yet despite all these roles, the essence of the bond remained unchanged: trust. Dogs trusted humans to provide shelter and safety. Humans trusted dogs to watch over them, to alert them, to stand beside them in uncertainty. This reciprocal trust became the core of the relationship. The evolution of dogs reflects their connection to humanity. Their bodies changed to fit human environments. Their minds adapted to decode human intention. Their loyalty became a defining trait. Each transformation reinforced the next, creating a species uniquely shaped by coexistence with us. Today, when a dog curls up near a person's feet or looks up with a familiar expression, it is participating in a story that began tens of thousands of years ago. That silent understanding, the feeling that this animal knows us, listens to us, and chooses to stay close, is rooted in ancient nights around campfires, in shared hunts, and in the quiet cooperation that formed the earliest bonds. Dogs are, in the truest sense, humanity's first friends. They walked with us through ice ages, across continents, and into new forms of life. They helped us survive, adapt, and thrive. And in doing so, they became more than companions. They became partners in our shared story. The connection endures not because we shaped dogs alone, but because dogs shaped us as well. Their presence made early humans safer, more aware, and more connected. They changed how we moved through the world, how we organized our communities, and how we understood loyalty and companionship. From the edge of ancient fires to the comfort of modern homes, the journey has been long, but the bond remains unchanged. A friendship written across time, carried forward by every dog that chooses to walk beside a human today. Thank you for joining this quiet journey into the ancient bond between humans and dogs. If this story helped you relax, or if you enjoy learning about history in a gentle, peaceful way, feel free to subscribe and support the channel. History for Sleep is still a growing channel, and your support helps us create more soothing documentaries, deeper explorations of the past, and more comforting narratives to fall asleep to. Good night, and we'll meet again in the next story.